Today we have a story about a woman whose name appears only once in the official records of Sumpter County, Alabama, single line in a plantation ledger dated August 3, 1842. Her name was Priscilla Green. What follows is an account pieced together from fragments, courthouse documents, plantation journals, patrol death records, and testimonies sealed for over a century. This is her story. If you enjoyed this story, consider subscribing and becoming part of our community. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. We love hearing from our amazing viewers all around the world. The morning of November 8, 1859, began like any other at Whitmore Plantation. Priscilla Green rose before dawn in the cabin she shared with her husband Jacob and 3 other enslaved families. She was 36 years old, though her hands looked older from 17 years of work. She moved quietly through the darkness, pulling on her hunting clothes canvas, breeches worn soft, a cotton shirt patched at the elbows, boots that Master Josiah Whitmore had given her because a hunter needed proper footwear. Jacob stirred on their pallet but did not wake. He had learned over the past months not to ask where his wife went. In her mind, during those long silences, something in Priscilla had changed since May, since that terrible day when their daughter Mercy was taken from them. She had become a woman made of iron and silence, still gentle with him, still kind to the others in the quarters, but distant somehow, as if she were standing at a great height, looking down on a world she no longer quite belonged to. Priscilla stepped outside into the pre-dawn cold. The big house sat a quarter-mile up the hill, its windows dark except for the kitchen, where the house slaves would already be starting fires. Beyond it stretched 4,000 acres of picked-over cotton fields, and beyond that, the forest, always the forest. She walked to the smokehouse where Master Whitmore kept her hunting tools. The overseer, a thin-faced man named Dalton Hayes, had given her a key years ago, an unusual trust, but Priscilla had earned it. She was the best hunter on the plantation, perhaps the best in the county. She brought back deer, wild boar, rabbits, turkey, quail. She never missed, she never wasted ammunition. She never tried to run. Priscilla selected her rifle, a simple muzzleloader, and her game bag. She checked her powder and shot, though she knew exactly how much she had. She had checked every morning for 17 years. This morning, however, she did not load the rifle. She simply carried it, a prop for the role she would play today. By the time the plantation bell rang at 6, calling the field hands to their work, Priscilla was already 2 miles into the forest. She moved through the November woods like smoke, making no sound on the carpet of fallen leaves. This had been her gift since childhood, this ability to become part of the landscape, to walk among the trees as if she herself was simply another shadow cast by early light. She had been born with a different name in a place so far from Alabama that its very existence felt like a dream. Her mother had been a beaner, a tracker and warrior in their village, a woman who could read the forest the way other people read books. A beaner had taught her daughter everything: how to identify every plant, how to predict animal movements, how to see patterns invisible to others, and most importantly, how to transform any terrain into a weapon. But that was before the raid, before the ship, before the auction block in Mobile, where a 10-year-old girl stood silent while men decided her worth in dollars. Master Whitmore had bought her for her hunting skills. Over 17 years, she had served him faithfully, bringing meat to his table, teaching herself English, learning to survive in this foreign land of pine forests and cotton fields. She had even found moments of something like happiness: her marriage to Jacob at age 19, the birth of their daughter Mercy 3 years later, the small freedoms that came with being trusted to work alone in the woods. And then May had come. May 7th, 1859, the day the patrol riders came to the quarters looking for a runaway from a neighboring plantation. They had found Mercy, 14 years old, walking back from the creek with a water bucket. They said she had no pass. They said she looked like she was thinking about running. They said she had been insolent when questioned. They hanged her from a roadside oak tree while Priscilla and Jacob were forced to watch. They left her body there for 3 days as a warning. The patrol captain, a man named Marcus Dillard, had stood under Mercy's swaying body and smiled. "This," he had said, "is what happens to runaways. This is what happens to defiance." Priscilla had not cried. She had not screamed. She had not begged. She had simply looked at her daughter's face, then at Captain Dillard's face, then at the faces of every man in that patrol. She had memorized them all. That night, something fundamental had shifted inside her. The woman who had learned to survive by being invisible, by being useful, by never causing trouble, that woman had died with Mercy. What remained was something older, something that remembered her mother's teachings, something that understood patience. For 6 months, Priscilla had walked these forests every day. Master Whitmore thought she was hunting game. The overseer thought she was checking her trap lines for rabbits. Jacob thought she was grieving in the only way she knew how. They were all wrong. Priscilla had been transforming 20 square miles of Sumpter County into something else entirely. She had been learning the patrol routes, studying their timing, identifying every trail and shortcut they used. She had been digging pits and covering them with latticed branches and leaves. She had been bending saplings into snares. She had been collecting poison from water hemlock and oleander. She had been loosening rocks on slopes and positioning logs that could roll with a gentle push. She had been preparing, and now, finally, the preparations were complete. This morning, as she stood in a clearing 3 miles from the plantation house, Priscilla reached into her pocket and withdrew a small cloth pouch. Inside was a lock of Mercy's hair, cut before they lowered her daughter into the ground. She held it against her heart and spoke in the language of her childhood, making the same promise she had made every day for 6 months. "Warbeta," she whispered. It meant, "They will pay." Priscilla knew the patrol schedule by heart now. Monday and Thursday nights, the Livingston Patrol under Captain Dillard, 19 men. Tuesday and Friday, the IPS Patrol, 17 men. Wednesday and Saturday, the Gainesville Patrol, 22 men. Sunday, special combinations, usually 12 to 15 men. Tonight was Monday. Tonight, Captain Dillard and his 19 riders would begin their weekly route at 7 in the evening, starting from Livingston and traveling counterclockwise through the plantation district. They would pass within 200 yards of where Priscilla now stood, and they would ride directly into the first of 34 traps she had spent 6 months preparing. The forest around her looked innocent. The trails looked safe. The familiar paths that the patrols had ridden for years appeared unchanged, but Priscilla knew better. She could see the latticed branches covered with leaves, the nearly invisible vine snares, the rocks that would roll with deadly momentum, the water sources contaminated with poison. She could see all of it because she had created all of it, and because her mother had taught her that the greatest weapon was never the one your enemy could see. As the sun climbed higher, Priscilla made her way to a limestone outcropping she had discovered months ago. It was concealed by mountain laurel and provided a perfect view of the main patrol route. She would wait here, hidden, watching. She would see them come, and she would bear witness to what followed. Because tonight, for the first time in 6 months, Priscilla Green would sleep, knowing that the men who killed her daughter had begun to pay their debt. Not with trial or justice, there was no such thing for people like her, but with something older and more certain. The forest would have its reckoning, and Priscilla would be its voice, its hands, its ancient and patient fury. She settled into a hidden position and waited for darkness. The archive records from Sumpter County showed that on May 7, 1859, a girl named Mercy Green was executed by the Livingston Patrol. The official report listed her age as approximately 14 and her crime as suspected flight. What the records do not show is what happened in the hours before her death, moments that would transform her mother from hunter to something else entirely. It had begun at mid-morning. Priscilla had been in the forest checking her rabbit snares when she heard the commotion from the quarters. By the time she arrived, running through the cotton fields with her heart in her throat, the patrol riders were already there, 19 white men on horseback, circling the slave cabins like wolves around prey. Captain Marcus Dillard sat tall on his grey gelding, his face expressionless beneath his wide-brimmed hat. He was a man of about 45, prosperous enough to own a small farm, but not wealthy enough to avoid patrol duty. He had been leading the Livingston Patrol for 8 years. Everyone knew his reputation. He was neither the cruelest nor the kindest. He was simply efficient. He did his job without passion or mercy. "We're looking for a runaway from the Henderson place," he announced to the assembled slaves. "Young buck, about 16, went missing 2 nights ago. Any of you seen him? You speak now." The enslaved people stood silent. Speaking to patrollers was dangerous, whether you had information or not. Captain Dillard's eyes moved over them with practiced assessment, looking for signs of guilt, of knowledge, of fear that exceeded the normal terror. That was when his gaze fell on Mercy. She had been coming back from the creek, carrying a wooden bucket of water for the midday meal. She was tall for her age, slim and graceful like her mother, with the same quiet strength in her face. She wore a simple cotton dress, faded from washing, and a headscarf that covered her hair. She looked at the ground, as she had been taught, as all of them had been taught, but something in her posture, some quality Captain Dillard perceived as defiance, made him rein his horse toward her. "You," he said, "where's your pass?" Mercy's eyes widened slightly. "Sir, I was just fetching water from the creek. Master Whitmore allows us to. I asked where your pass is." His voice remained level, almost bored. "You're off plantation grounds without written permission. That's a violation. The creek is on plantation grounds, sir." Mercy's voice was respectful, but Priscilla, standing frozen among the other slaves, felt ice forming in her stomach. She knew that tone. It was the tone of someone stating a simple fact, unaware of how dangerous facts could be. One of the other patrollers, a heavy-set man named Wesley Hancock, laughed. "Girl's got a mouth on her." Captain Dillard dismounted slowly. He walked to where Mercy stood, the water bucket still in her hands. He was not a large man, but he carried authority like a physical weight. "Are you arguing with me?" "No, sir." Mercy lowered her eyes further. "I was just explaining." Dillard turned to his men. "She's explaining to me now." The other patrollers grinned. This was entertainment, a break in the monotony of their rounds. Priscilla stepped forward, her voice careful and small. "Sir, please, she's just a child. She don't mean no disrespect. I'm her mother. Whatever she'd done wrong, I take responsibility." Captain Dillard glanced at Priscilla without interest. "You, the one they call the hunter, Whitmore's tracker?" "Yes, sir." "Then you should have taught your daughter better manners." He turned back to Mercy. "Set that bucket down." Mercy obeyed, her hands beginning to shake. She knew, as they all knew, that this had gone wrong somehow, that something in the normal terror of patrol encounters had shifted into something worse. "You know what I think?" Captain Dillard said conversationally, still addressing his men rather than Mercy herself. "I think we got us a potential runner here. Got that look about her, rebellious, thinking she's clever, thinking she can talk her way around the rules." "No, sir." Mercy's voice cracked. "I ain't thinking about running. I never thought about running. I was just fetching water like I do every day." "Just fetching water," Dillard repeated. "Like you do every day, without a pass, breaking the law every single day, and thinking it's fine because nobody caught you before." He looked at Priscilla. "That what you taught her? That rules don't matter if you don't get caught?" "No, sir. I taught her to obey. I taught her clearly didn't teach her well enough." He nodded to Wesley Hancock and another man named Thomas Blevins. "Get a rope." The world tilted. Priscilla heard herself screaming, felt herself being grabbed by other patrollers as she tried to reach her daughter. She saw Mercy's face, saw the terror flooding into it as she realized what was happening. She saw the rope being thrown over a branch of the old oak tree that stood at the edge of the quarters. She saw Master Whitmore hurrying from the big house, shouting that this was his property, that he hadn't authorized punishment, that there must be a misunderstanding. But Captain Dillard had already made his decision. "The law gives me authority to punish slaves found in violation." This girl was off quarters without a pass, and she was insolent when questioned. Under state statute, that's sufficient cause for correction. Correction? Master Whitmore's face had gone red. "You can't hang my property. I'll have you in court. File your complaint in Livingston, sir. I'm acting within my legal rights. You'll be compensated for any loss of property value." Property. They were discussing her daughter as property while the noose was fitted around Mercy's neck, while her baby girl sobbed and begged, while Priscilla fought against the hands holding her with strength born of absolute desperation. And then Wesley Hancock kicked the stump away, and Mercy's body dropped, and the rope went taut, and the world ended. For 3 days, they left her body hanging. As a warning, Captain Dillard said, as a reminder of what happens to defiance, Priscilla sat under that tree for all 3 days. She did not eat. She did not sleep. She simply sat and looked up at her daughter's face. And in those 72 hours, something fundamental rewrote itself inside her mind. The survival instincts that had kept her alive for 17 years, the learned helplessness, the careful obedience, the practiced invisibility, all of it burned away, like morning mist under a terrible sun. What remained was clear and cold and absolutely certain. On the evening of the 3rd day, when they finally cut Mercy down and allowed her burial, Priscilla stood at the gravesite and made a promise in the language of her mother, the language of her childhood. She promised that every man who had been present that day, every man who had tied the noose or kicked the stump or sat on a horse and watched, Every single one of them would die. Not quickly, not cleanly, but inevitably. She did not know yet how she would keep this promise, but her mother had taught her that knowledge was a weapon, that patience was a weapon, that the land itself could become a weapon in hands that knew how to use it. For 6 months, Priscilla had honored Mercy's memory with silence and preparation. She had walked the forests every day, mapping patrol routes, identifying trails, learning the patterns of men who thought themselves invincible. She had dug holes and covered them. She had bent saplings into snares. She had collected poison from plants that grew wild in Alabama's wet places. She had loosened rocks and positioned logs. She had made the land itself her accomplice. And now, on this November evening, as she waited in her hidden place above the trail, Priscilla knew that the accounting was about to begin. The first payment was due. The first name on her list would be crossed off tonight. She touched the pouch containing Mercy's hair and whispered the same promise she had whispered every day for 6 months. Warbaiter, they will pay. Below her hiding place, the trail stretched empty in the fading light, but Priscilla could hear them coming, the jingle of bridles, the clop of hooves on hard ground, the voices of men who had no reason to fear the forest they rode through. They did not know that the forest had changed. They did not know that every familiar trail now hid death. They did not know that grief and ancient knowledge had transformed 20 square miles into a killing ground. They would learn tonight. One by one, they would learn. And Priscilla, the hunter, the mother, the woman made invisible by slavery, she would be there to watch every lesson. The courthouse. Records from Sumpter County contain a curious gap in patrol death reports between May and November of 1859. In previous years, patrol fatalities were rare, but documented a riding accident here, a snake bite there, an occasional drowning. But after May 7th, the records show only normal patrol activities, routine duties, no incidents worth noting, until November 8th, when everything changed. During those 6 months of silence, Priscilla transformed herself from grieving mother into something the South had never seen before, a strategist who used African ancestral knowledge to wage invisible warfare against a system that considered her less than human. Her work had begun simply. In the first weeks after Mercy's death, she had walked the forests in genuine grief, moving through the pine groves and river bottoms like a ghost, seeking her daughter's spirit. Jacob had watched her leave each morning with the worry of a husband who sees his wife slipping away but doesn't know how to reach her. "You hardly eat," he had said one night in their cabin, his voice low so the others wouldn't hear. "You hardly sleep. Priscilla, I'm scared for you." She had touched his face gently. This man who had loved her for 17 years, who had grieved with her but who could not follow where she was going. "I'm still here, Jacob, I promise you, I'm still here." But it was not entirely true. The Priscilla who had been content to survive, who had found small joys in their life despite its brutality, who had believed that keeping her head down would keep her family safe, that woman had died with Mercy. What remained was harder, colder, more ancient. One morning in late May, while checking her rabbit snares 3 miles north of the plantation, Priscilla had heard horses. She had frozen, becoming invisible in the way her mother had taught her, blending into the undergrowth until she was simply another shadow among shadows. Through the trees, she had watched the patrol pass. Wesley Hancock's voice reaching her clearly as he laughed about something, the same man who had kicked the stump beneath Mercy's feet. And in that moment, watching them ride their familiar circuit with absolute confidence, Priscilla had understood something fundamental. These men knew the trails. They had ridden them for years. They trusted the ground beneath their horses' hooves. That trust was their weakness. Her mother's voice had come back to her then, words spoken in their village a lifetime ago. "The best trap is the one your enemy cannot see until it is already triggered. Use what they know against them. Make their certainty their doom." From that day forward, Priscilla's daily hunts had taken on a different purpose. She still brought back game she needed to maintain her cover, her value to Master Whitmore, but she also began mapping every trail the patrols used, every shortcut, every creek crossing, every place where the land presented opportunities for what her mother had called quiet killing. She discovered that the patrol routes, while varied in timing, followed predictable geographic patterns. They had toothed terrain dictated movement. There were only so many paths through dense pine forest, only so many places to cross swampy ground, only so many shortcuts between plantations. The patrollers thought this knowledge made them efficient. Priscilla understood it made them vulnerable. In June, she had begun to dig. The first pit took her 3 nights, working in darkness with a sharpened stick and her bare hands, excavating a hole 8 feet deep and 5 feet across in a narrow section of trail, where a single rider would pass, but where the surrounding trees prevented a horse from going around. She lined the bottom with sharpened stakes cut from young pine and fire-hardened in a concealed location near the river. Then she created a false floor using a lattice of branches, covered it with leaves and pine needles, and memorized its exact location by the specific arrangement of trees around it. The second pit went faster. She was learning the most efficient techniques. The third and fourth faster still. By July, she had created 12 major pit traps positioned along different sections of patrol routes, each invisible, each ready to swallow horse and rider into an embrace of sharpened stakes. But pits were not enough. They were too localized, too easily avoided once discovered. Priscilla needed redundancy, multiple mechanisms that would work together, that would drive the patrols into each other's effects like a hunted animal running from one trap into another. In July, she began crafting snare traps. These were more complex than the rabbit snares she made for hunting. These required understanding human height on horseback, understanding momentum and body weight, understanding how a vine noose would tighten under the right conditions. She bent young saplings and secured them with triggers that would release when a rider passed at the correct position. She positioned the snares on trails where men would be moving fast, where their attention would be focused ahead, rather than at eye level where a vine might be hanging. Her mother had taught her that the best snares were the ones that looked like natural growth. Priscilla wove her grapevine nooses to appear like ordinary hanging vines, the kind that draped from trees throughout Alabama's forests. Only when a rider's weight hit the trigger would the noose drop and tighten, and by then it would be too late. In August, an older enslaved woman named Ruth approached Priscilla in the quarters. Ruth was near 60, had lived through more horrors than she could count, and had developed the kind of perception that comes from surviving decades of watchfulness. "Chilly," she said quietly while they sat shelling peas together. "I see you going out every morning with that rifle, coming back every evening with game. But I also see your face. You ain't hunting animals anymore, are you?" Priscilla's hands had stilled on the peas. Around them, other women worked and talked, and in that noise there was a kind of privacy. She looked at Ruth's weathered face and saw something she had not expected. Not fear, not judgment, but a kind of fierce approval. "I don't know what you mean," Priscilla said carefully. "Yes, you do?" Ruth's voice was barely a whisper. "And I ain't gonna speak on it, not to nobody, ever. But I want you to know whatever you're doing out there in those woods, some of us understand. Some of us been praying for someone like you for a long, long time." Priscilla had felt tears prick her eyes for the first time since Mercy's death. She had been so alone in her fury, so isolated in her planning. To know that someone saw, that someone understood, that someone prayed for her success, was a gift she had not known she needed. "They took my baby," she whispered. "I know, Chilly. They took mine too. 20 years back, sold him south when he was 7. I never seen him again." Ruth's hands continued their work, steady and practiced. "The Lord tells us to turn the other cheek, but the Lord also gave us minds and hands and the will to protect our own. You do what you got to do, and know that you ain't alone, even when you think you are." By September, Priscilla had added rock traps to her arsenal. Alabama's hills were full of loose stone, precariously balanced by centuries of erosion. She found places where trails ran beneath slopes, and she spent nights carefully undermining rocks until they rested at tipping points. A rope tied to a trigger, a tripwire across a trail. Any sudden movement would send tons of stone rolling down onto riders below. She also found deadfall locations, places where large logs could be positioned above narrow passages, held by carefully weakened supports that would collapse under the right pressure. These were perhaps her most dangerous creations, because constructing them required time and physical strength, but they were also among the most effective, capable of crushing multiple riders at once. The poison work came last, in October, because it required the most care. One mistake and she would die before completing her task. Priscilla had learned plant knowledge from 17 years of hunting and foraging, but now she reviewed that knowledge with deadly purpose. She identified every poisonous plant in the region: oleander, growing near the river, water hemlock in the swamps, jimson weed in disturbed soil. She harvested them at their most potent times, boiled them into concentrated extracts using a hidden pot in a cave near the Satelpa River, and used these to contaminate springs and seeps where patrols regularly stopped to water their horses. The poison was perhaps her most insidious weapon because its effects were delayed and deniable. A man who drank from a contaminated spring might not show symptoms for days. By then, he would have no way to connect his illness to that forest stream. He would simply sicken and die, and his death would be attributed to disease or bad luck, never to murder. By early November, the network was complete. 34 separate mechanisms spread across 20 square miles. Pits that would swallow horses, snares that would strangle riders, rock slides that would crush patrols, deadfalls that would obliterate entire groups, and poisons that would kill slowly, invisibly, leaving no trace of their true source. Priscilla had created a killing ground that looked exactly like the forest it had always been, and she had done it while maintaining perfect obedience, perfect civility, perfect invisibility. Every morning she hunted game for Master Whitmore's table. Every afternoon she skinned her kills and helped in the quarters. Every evening she sat with Jacob and spoke of small things, the weather, the crops, the gossip among the enslaved community. Only at night, lying beside her sleeping husband, did she allow herself to think of what was coming. She would reach into her pocket and feel the small pouch containing Mercy's hair, and she would repeat her promise in the language of her childhood. War beta. They will pay. On November 7th, the night before the first patrol was scheduled, Priscilla could not sleep. She lay in the darkness of the cabin listening to the breathing of the others, feeling Jacob's warmth beside her, and she felt something that surprised her, not fear, not excitement, but a kind of profound peace. She had done everything her knowledge and her grief and her mother's training allowed. Whether it succeeded or failed, she had honored Mercy the only way a powerless woman could honor her murdered child, by transforming her powerlessness into the most patient, most invisible, most deadly form of resistance that the South had ever seen. At dawn on November 8th, she rose and prepared for the last day of her old life. Tonight, the reckoning would begin. Tonight, she would learn if 17 years of survival had taught her enough to also learn vengeance. She kissed Jacob goodbye. She collected her rifle and her game bag. She walked into the forest for what might be the last time, and she waited for darkness. What follows is reconstructed from patrol records, plantation journals, and testimony taken in closed session by the Sumpter County Sheriff in late November 1859. The official investigation concluded that the deaths were due to accidents of terrain and darkness, but certain details in the sealed depositions suggest that at least some officials suspected something closer to the truth. Priscilla reached her observation position at the limestone outcropping by meat. She had chosen this location with Carrot, provided a clear view of the main patrol route while remaining completely hidden behind mountain laurel and rock. She settled into wait, her rifle across her knees, though she knew she would not fire it. Her weapons tonight were already in place, invisible, patient, lethal. The November air grew cold as the sun descended. Priscilla ate nothing, drank from a canteen she had filled that morning, and watched the trail below. Her mind was clear in a way it had not been since May. For 6 months, she had carried the weight of her grief and her planning, the constant fear of discovery, the terrible knowledge of what she intended. Now, on the edge of action, she felt only a kind of crystalline calm. At 7 o'clock, right on schedule, she heard them coming. The sound reached her before the sights, the jingle of bridles and bits, the multiple footfalls of horses moving at a walk, the voices of men who felt completely safe in their domain. Priscilla's hands tightened on her rifle, though she kept her breathing steady, even, silent. Everything her mother had taught her about stillness came back now. She became the rock she sat upon, the laurel that concealed her. Nothing more than a shadow in the gathering dusk. Captain Marcus Dillard came into view first. Riding his distinctive grey gelding, he sat straight in the saddle, his rifle resting across his lap, his eyes scanning the trees more from habit than from any sense of danger. Behind him rode his patrol, 19 men in loose formation, some talking among themselves, others silent, all of them armed with rifles and pistols and the absolute confidence of men who had never known defeat. Priscilla recognized faces as they passed below her position. There was Wesley Hancock on his large bay, the heavyset man who had kicked the stump from beneath Mercy's feet. There was Thomas Blevins, who had tied the noose. There was Samuel Garrett, who had written the sign that hung around Mercy's neck. "This is what happens to runaways." There were others whose names she did not know, but whose faces she had memorized during those 3 terrible days when Mercy's body hung as their trophy. She watched them pass, counted them 19 riders, as expected. She waited until the last horse disappeared around a bend in the trail. Then she rose from her hidden place and began to move through the forest parallel to their route, tracking them by sound as they headed toward their first stop at Bellamy Plantation. Priscilla moved with the silence of smoke. She knew every tree in this forest, every root that might trip, every branch that might snap. She had walked these paths hundreds of times over the past 6 months, practicing until she could navigate them in total darkness. Now, in the gray light of evening, she flowed through the woods like water, arriving at her first prepared position well before the patrol would reach it. The position overlooked a section of trail that narrowed between old-growth pines. The ground appeared solid, covered with the normal layer of leaves and pine needles that carpeted the forest floor. But beneath that innocuous surface, Priscilla had dug an 8-foot pit lined with fire-hardened stakes. The false floor she had constructed from woven branches was calibrated. Precisely, it would hold under the weight of a single horse but would collapse. Under heavier combined weight, she climbed into a position above the trail, where she could observe without being seen, then settled in to wait once more. Below her, the pit trap was invisible. Even knowing exactly where it was, Priscilla could barely detect the slight unevenness in the leaf cover. 2 riders moving in failing light, it would be completely undetectable. The patrol came back into earshot 10 minutes later. They had finished their check of Bellamy Plantation. Nothing found. No runaways discovered, just the routine intimidation of enslaved people who could not resist them. Now they were moving at a faster pace, cantering along the familiar trail toward their next stop. Captain Dillard's gray came first, moving at a controlled canter. Priscilla watched as the horse approached the trap. As its hooves struck the false floor and passed over safely, the latticed branches held under single animal weight, exactly as she had calculated. The gray gelding continued without breaking stride. The second rider, however, was Wesley Hancock on his heavy bay. Horse and rider together weighed well over 500 pounds. When the bay's front hooves struck the trap cover, the carefully calibrated branches gave way instantly. Priscilla watched the earth open beneath the horse's feet. She heard the animal's scream, a sound that would haunt her in the years that followed, though she never regretted causing it. The bay plunged through, its momentum carrying it directly onto the stakes below. Wesley Hancock catapulted forward as his mount disappeared, his body slamming into the far edge of the pit with enough force that Priscilla heard his neck snap from 30 yards away. But the patrol could not stop. The horse behind Hancock's could not halt its momentum in time. It tried to leap the suddenly visible pit, crashed into the opposite edge, and threw its rider directly into the hole. 2 horses thrashing on stakes, 2 men dead in seconds. The entire patrol column in sudden chaos. Captain Dillard wheeled his gray around, shouting orders that no one could hear over the screaming of injured horses. The patrol bunched up on the narrow trail, trying to understand what had happened, trying to control mounts that were panicking at the smell of blood and the sounds of dying animals. And then Samuel Garrett, the man who had written the sign for Mercy's neck, hit the snare trap. The grapevine loop had been positioned at chest height for a mounted rider. When Garrett's horse passed beneath it, the noose settled over his shoulders. His momentum triggered the release mechanism. The slipknot tightened instantly as the bent sapling yanked upward with tremendous force. Garrett was pulled backward off his horse, the vine crushing his throat, and suddenly he was swinging 3 feet off the ground, legs kicking, hands clawing at the noose, strangling in full view of his companions. 3 men dead in less than a minute. The patrol dissolved into chaos. Some riders tried to reach Garrett, but their horses were too frightened by the pit trap ahead to push forward. Others attempted to help the men in the pit, but the thrashing of dying horses and the presence of the sharpened stakes made rescue impossible. Captain Dillard screamed for order, for weapons, for someone to explain what was happening, but there was nothing to explain. No enemy to shoot, no slaves in uprising, no visible threat, just the trail itself becoming hostile, the familiar ground betraying them, and that made no sense. This was Alabama in 1859. The land belonged to white men. It obeyed white men. It could not, would not, turn against them, yet it had. From her position above the carnage, Priscilla felt something settle in her chest. Not satisfaction, exactly, but a kind of grim acknowledgement. This was working. The 6 months of preparation, the careful planning, the patient construction, it was all working exactly as her mother's teachings had promised it would. 3 names crossed off her list. 16 men remained in this patrol alone, and she had 31 more traps waiting along their route. She watched Captain Dillard finally restore some order, watched him send riders ahead and behind to check the trail, watched him organize the living to recover the dead. It took them nearly an hour, and by the time they had pulled the bodies from the pit and cut Samuel Garrett down from his vine noose, full darkness had fallen. Priscilla used that hour to move ahead to her next position. She knew where they would go. The only clear path away from the disaster led directly to her second trap complex, a quarter-mile ahead where the trail passed beneath a slope she had undermined with careful patience over 3 weeks in August. As she settled into her new position, Priscilla touched the pouch containing Mercy's hair and whispered again, "Warbeta, they will pay." Below her, she could hear the patrol reorganizing, could hear Captain Dillard's voice raised in anger and confusion, giving orders to continue despite the deaths. They would ride forward because riding forward was all they knew how to do. They would continue their patrol because to turn back would be to admit that something incomprehensible had defeated them. And with each step forward, they would move deeper into Priscilla's web. She waited in the darkness, patient as stone, as the patrol began to move again. 16 men now instead of 19, riding more cautiously but still riding, still trusting that the next section of trail would be safe because the last 100 times they had ridden it, it had been safe. They did not understand yet that safety was an illusion she had spent 6 months stripping away. They did not understand that every familiar path was now a potential death sentence. They did not understand that a woman they would have dismissed as powerless had transformed their world into a nightmare, from which there would be no waking. But they would learn. Over the next hours and the next months, they would learn, and Priscilla, invisible in the darkness, would be there to witness every lesson. The Sumpter County Sheriff's reports from November and December of 1859 make for chilling reading. What begins as isolated incident reports, patrol accident near Bellamy Plantation, gradually shifts to something approaching panic. By late December, the sheriff was writing in his private journal, "The forests have become death traps. We have lost 58 men in 6 weeks. This is not accident. This is not coincidence. But I cannot name what it is." The night of November 8th was only the beginning. After the first 3 deaths, Captain Dillard's patrol had continued forward with grim determination. They had 16 men left, and Dillard was not a man who quit, but he was also not a fool. He ordered the patrol to move slowly, to watch the ground, to test uncertain terrain before committing weight to it. It did not help. Priscilla's second trap complex was positioned at a place where the trail passed beneath a hillside. Over several weeks in August, she had identified a large boulder perched precariously at the hill's crest, held in place by roots and smaller rocks. She had spent nights carefully undermining its supports, removing the stabilizing stones, cutting through roots with a knife stolen from the plantation's toolshed. By September, the boulder rested at a tipping point, held by a single twisted root and her own will. She had attached a rope to that root. The other end of the rope crossed the trail at ankle height, concealed beneath leaves. When the lead riders passed over the tripwire, the rope pulled taut. The root snapped. The boulder, weighing perhaps 2 tons, began to roll. And because Priscilla had chosen this location with care, its path did not simply go straight down. It hit other rocks she had loosened, which hit others, and suddenly the hillside was of stone and earth and broken trees cascading down onto the trail below. Captain Dillard's grey gelding sensed the danger and reared, saving Dillard's life by throwing him clear. 4 men behind him were not so fortunate. The rocks crushed horses and riders both, killing instantly. 2 other riders were knocked from their saddles and buried under debris with injuries that meant slow death, broken backs, crushed legs, internal bleeding. The patrol was now down to 10 men. 10 men who were beginning to understand that something impossible was happening. Priscilla watched from her concealed position as the survivors dug through rubble, trying to find the dead and wounded. She watched Captain Dillard's face in the torchlight, watched him realize that this was no accident, that somehow the trail itself had become weaponized. She saw him look around at the dark forest with new eyes that recognized, perhaps for the first time in his life, that he was not safe, that his authority meant nothing to the land, that something was hunting him. "We need to get back to Livingston," one of the surviving riders said, his voice shaking. We need to report this. We need help. Report what? Captain Dillard's voice was harsh. That the ground is trying to kill us. That rocks are falling on patrol routes that have been safe for 10 years. Who'll believe that? I don't care if they believe it. I ain't riding no further tonight. Several other men murmured agreement. They were scared now. These men who made their living by creating fear in others. They were tasting their own medicine. And they did not like the flavor. But turning back meant riding through the sections where the first deaths had occurred. And none of them wanted to do that either. They were trapped between unknown dangers ahead, unknown dangers behind, and the realization showed in their faces. Finally, Captain Dillard made a decision. We go forward to Whitmore Plantation. It's closer than Livingston. We'll stop there, rest the horses, and ride back to town at first light, when we can see what we're doing. It was a reasonable plan. It was also exactly what Priscilla had predicted he would decide. The human mind, when threatened, seeks the nearest safety. Whitmore Plantation was less than 2 miles ahead. Livingston was 5 miles behind through dangerous ground. Of course they would go forward. And of course, the path to Whitmore led through the most concentrated section of Priscilla's trap network. She moved ahead of them again, flowing through the forest like a ghost, arriving at position after position where she knew they would pass. Over the next hour, as the reduced patrol tried to reach safety, they encountered 5 more mechanisms. A snare trap that caught a rider named Thomas Blevins. The man who had tied Mercy's noose left him strangling from a grapevine, while his companions watched helplessly, too frightened to approach the body once they had cut it down, not knowing if the vines themselves would attack. A section of false ground over a ravine, carefully prepared to look solid, but actually covering a 15-foot drop onto jagged rocks. 2 horses and riders plunged through, screaming into darkness. A deadfall trap where suspended logs came crashing down onto the trail when a tripwire was triggered, killing 1 man instantly and injuring 2 others so severely they could not ride. A pit trap near a creek crossing, this one filled with water and positioned where men would be dismounting to water horses. 1 man stepped directly into it in the darkness, fell onto stakes hidden beneath the water's surface, and died screaming. By the time the patrol reached Whitmore Plantation, 5 men remained from the original 19. 5 men riding on exhausted, terrified horses, covered in their companions' blood, their faces showing a kind of shock that went beyond fear into existential horror. Priscilla watched them arrive from the darkness beyond the big house's lights. She watched as Master Whitmore came out in his nightclothes, as Captain Dillard tried to explain what had happened. As the house slaves were roused to care for the injured, she watched and felt nothing except a cold satisfaction. 14 men dead, 14 names crossed off her list. But this was only the Livingston Patrol, only one of 4 groups that rotated through Sumpter County. The IAP's patrol would ride tomorrow night, Tuesday. 17 men who did not yet know that the forest had changed. The Gainesville Patrol would ride Wednesday. 22 men riding toward death they could not imagine. Priscilla slipped away from the plantation house and made her way back to the quarters. She entered the cabin quietly, finding Jacob awake and waiting for her. "Where you been?" His voice was worried but not accusatory. "I heard something happened to the patrol. They saying 14 men died tonight on the trails." "I was hunting," Priscilla said, removing her boots. "Got a deer down near the Satelpa River. Took longer than expected to dress it out." Jacob looked at her for a long moment. He was not a stupid man. He had seen the change in his wife over the past 6 months. He had noted her obsessive walking of the forests, her questions about patrol routes and timing. He had watched grief transform her into something harder than the woman he had married. Now, on a night when 14 patrol riders had died in the forests, his wife walked every day. He looked at her and made a choice between knowledge that might get him killed and ignorance that might let him live, a choice between his wife's justice and his own survival. "You'd be careful out there," he said finally. "Something's making those forests dangerous. I don't want to lose you too." Priscilla kissed his forehead. "You won't lose me. I promised you that." She lay down beside him and closed her eyes, but she did not sleep. Her mind was already planning for tomorrow night, for the IAPS patrol's Tuesday route, for the traps they would encounter. She had built redundancy into her network precisely because she knew that after the first deaths, the patrols would become more cautious. But caution would not save them, because caution assumes you know what to be cautious of, and the patrols did not know, could not know, would never know until it was too late. In the darkness, Priscilla touched the pouch containing Mercy's hair and whispered her promise once more. War bait. They will pay across the county, in homes and taverns and patrol stations. The survivors of Captain Dillard's patrol were trying to make sense of what had happened. They told stories that sounded like madness, ground that opened without warning, vines that strangled, rocks that fell like judgment from heaven, paths that had been safe for years suddenly becoming deadly. The authorities listened with skepticism bordering on contempt. 14 men dead from accidents, on trails they had ridden hundreds of times. It sounded like excuse-making, like cowardice, like men trying to cover up some failure of duty or courage. But the bodies told a different story. Bodies crushed by falling rock, bodies impaled on wooden stakes, bodies strangled by vines, bodies that suggested coordination, planning, purpose. The sheriff looked at the evidence and felt a cold finger trace his spine. This was not accident. This was not coincidence. This was warfare. But warfare by whom? Against whom and how? The answers would not come. Not that night, not that month, not in the entire 4 months that Priscilla's campaign of vengeance ran its course, because the person responsible was invisible, powerless, beyond suspicion. She was just Priscilla Green, Whitmore's hunter, a quiet enslaved woman, who brought game to the big house table and caused no trouble and knew her place. She was the last person anyone would suspect, which made her the perfect weapon, hidden in plain sight, patient as death, as certain as the turning of seasons. Tomorrow night, 17 more men would ride into her web, and the night after that, 22 more, and in the weeks and months that followed, the forests of Sumpter County would claim 74 victims total, each death appearing like terrible accident, each one adding another name to Mercy's memorial, another payment on a debt that could never truly be settled, but could at least be partially honored. Priscilla lay in the darkness of the cabin and listened to Jacob's breathing, to the sounds of the quarters settling for the night, to the distant calls of owls in the forest that had become her ally and her weapon. She did not sleep. She planned, and the forest waited, patient and hungry, for tomorrow night's prey. The sealed testimony of Sheriff William Craddock, taken December 15, 1859, contains a passage that was suppressed from public record for over a century. I have examined 58 death sites across 3 counties. The mechanisms vary, but the precision does not. Someone with extraordinary knowledge of terrain and human behavior has transformed 20 square miles of forest into a killing ground. I cannot determine who, I cannot determine how, but I know this is not accident. This is murder. This is war. The Tuesday patrol never made it back to IEP's. Captain Wesley Hancock led 17 men out at 7 in the evening on November 9th. They had heard rumors about Captain Dillard's patrol, wild stories that sounded like panic or drunkenness. Hancock, a practical man who believed in what he could see and touch, dismissed the stories as exaggeration. Trails could not become deadly overnight. Ground that had been safe for years did not simply turn hostile. He was wrong on both counts. Priscilla watched from a different observation point as the IEP's patrol rode past. She had spent the daylight hours checking her traps, resetting mechanisms that had been triggered the previous night, adding new elements to sections the patrols might try to avoid. She worked with the methodical patience of someone engaged in a craft. She had spent a lifetime mastering the IEP's. Patrol encountered their first trap at the creek crossing near Henderson Plantation. It was one of Priscilla's water mechanisms, a section of stream that looked shallow and solid, but was actually quicksand, barely concealed beneath a finger's depth of running water. She had spent weeks in September creating this trap, diverting the stream to flow over a pocket of fine silt and clay, then carefully disguising her work so the crossing appeared safe. The first 3 riders made it across without incident. Their horses distributed weight correctly, moved quickly enough, but the 4th rider stopped in the middle of the stream to let his horse drink. Within seconds, horse and rider began to sink. The animal panicked, thrashing, which only accelerated the process. The rider tried to dismount but was dragged down by his heavy coat and weapons. Other patrol members tried to rescue him, but anyone who entered the quicksand to help also began to sink. Priscilla watched as 4 men died in the space of 10 minutes, drowning in what should have been knee-deep water, their companions helpless to save them. The surviving patrol members pulled back from the creek in horror, staring at the innocent-looking stream that had just consumed 4 of their number. Over the next 3 hours, the IEP's patrol encountered 11 more traps. By midnight, 3 men remained alive from the original 17. 3 men who rode through the darkness in a state of shock that bordered on madness, their horses exhausted, their weapons unfired because there was nothing to shoot, their understanding of the world fundamentally shattered. Wednesday brought the Gainesville Patrol, 22 men under Captain Bernard Pritchard, the largest and most experienced patrol group in the region. Captain Pritchard had been leading patrols for 12 years. He knew every trail, every plantation, every shortcut in 3 counties. He was careful, methodical, and he absolutely did not believe the stories about hostile forests and death traps. He also died first. Priscilla had positioned a special mechanism for the Gainesville Patrol's traditional route. It was a combination trapper pit covered with false floor, but with the added element of a snare positioned directly before it. When Captain Pritchard's horse triggered the snare, the sudden stop threw Pritchard forward. He tried to catch himself but stepped directly onto the false floor. He fell into the pit, onto sharpened stakes, dying within seconds. His final expression one of complete bewilderment. The Gainesville Patrol fared no better than the others. By dawn on Thursday, 7 men remained from 27 men who rode into Livingston babbling about vines that attacked, ground that opened, rocks that fell with impossible precision. 7 men who would never ride patrol again, who would wake screaming from nightmares for the rest of their lives. The authorities could no longer dismiss what was happening as accident or coincidence. 53 men dead in 3 nights. The county called in militia from Montgomery. They brought dogs and trackers. They examined the death sites with growing horror. What they found made no sense. The mechanisms were invisible until triggered. The materials were all natural wood, stone, plant fiber, nothing manufactured or imported. The design was sophisticated, showing knowledge of physics, biology, and human behavior that seemed impossible for the time and place. And most disturbing of all, the traps showed no signs of having been recently constructed. They looked like they had been part of the landscape for years, which was impossible, which meant their investigation was fundamentally flawed, which meant they understood nothing. The militia tried to secure the patrol routes. They posted guards at key intersections. They traveled in daylight with engineers and surveyors. They found and disabled 12 traps over 4 days of careful work. Priscilla watched their efforts with interest. Then she simply created 12 new traps in different locations. The forests were vast. Her knowledge was comprehensive, and her patience was infinite. By late November, the patrol system had effectively collapsed. No one would ride at night. The few patrols that attempted day rounds moved in large groups, never dismounting, never stopping, terrified of every shadow and stream. The enslaved population noticed the change and began to test boundaries. Small acts of resistance multiplied. A few attempted escapes succeeded where they would have failed before. The plantation owners panicked. Their entire system depended on the patrol network maintaining constant terror. Without it, control began to slip. They offered rewards for information, $1,000 for anyone who could identify who was responsible for the trap network. No one came forward, not because they did not know several of the enslaved people had begun to suspect Priscilla after the first week, but because they would never betray her. This was their vengeance too, their victory too, even if they could not acknowledge it openly. Ruth, the older woman who had blessed Priscilla's work months before, approached her in early December as they worked together in the quarters. They offering $1,000 for information. Ruth said quietly, "That's more money than most folks gonna see in a lifetime." "I know," Priscilla said, her hands steady as she mended a shirt. "Ain't nobody gonna talk. You know that, right? Ain't none of us gonna say nothing, not ever. Not for all the money in Alabama." Priscilla looked up at Ruth's weathered face and saw tears in the older woman's eyes. "You given us something," Ruth whispered. "You given us proof that we ain't powerless, that we ain't nothing. You shown that one woman with a mind and a will can bring down the whole system of terror they built to keep us down. That's worth more than any reward. That's worth dying for. Nobody needs to die for this except the men who earned it." Priscilla said firmly, "You stay quiet, you stay safe, you let me do what I have to do." But Ruth shook her head. "Chilly, you're done, already done it. 70 men dead and counting. The patrol's broken. The master's scared. You already won. Now you've just got to survive it." Priscilla knew Ruth was right. The campaign had exceeded her most optimistic expectations. She had thought she might kill 10 or 15 men before being discovered. Instead, she had dismantled the entire patrol system of 3 counties, killed over 70 riders, and remained completely unsuspected. but she also knew the danger had not passed. The authorities were hunting for someone, and eventually their investigation might narrow. Someone might talk. Something might give her away. She needed to be careful, to maintain her cover, to continue playing the role of simple hunter who knew nothing of the deaths in the forests. She walked every day. In mid-December, a federal marshal arrived from Montgomery to investigate. He interviewed everyone: plantation owners, overseers, surviving patrol members, even some of the enslaved people. He examined death sites with engineers and surveyors. He compiled reports that filled dozens of pages. When he reached Whitmore Plantation, he asked to speak with the hunter named Priscilla, the woman who knew the forests better than anyone. Priscilla stood before him in the big house parlor, her eyes respectfully lowered, her hands folded, every inch the obedient slave who knew her place. The marshal was a thin man with sharp eyes and an air of frustrated intelligence. "You walk those forests every day," he said. "You must have seen something. Noticed something unusual." "No, sir," Priscilla said softly. "I just hunt game for Master Whitmore's table. I keep my eyes on the ground, looking for tracks. I don't pay much attention to nothing else." "But you must have heard the deaths, the patrol riders. Over 70 men now." "Yes, sir. Terrible thing. Everyone's saying the forests have gone dangerous somehow." "Do you believe that? That the forests themselves are dangerous?" Priscilla looked up briefly, letting him see simple confusion in her face. "I don't rightly know what to believe, sir. I just know I've been hunting these woods for 17 years and never had no trouble. But I'm alone, mostly. I move quiet. Maybe that makes a difference." The marshal studied her for a long moment. Priscilla could see him evaluating, considering, trying to determine if this quiet enslaved woman could possibly be connected to the sophisticated killing network that had decimated the patrol system. She saw the moment when he dismissed the possibility. She was too simple, too powerless, too obviously incapable of such complexity. "If you notice anything unusual," he said finally, "you report it immediately. There's a reward." "Yes, sir. I surely will." He left without another word. Priscilla returned to the quarters, feeling the cold weight of near discovery in her stomach. She had passed the test, but only because the marshal could not imagine that an enslaved woman possessed the knowledge and capability required for what had been done. His failure of imagination was his weakness, and Priscilla's strength. That night, lying beside Jacob in the darkness, Priscilla made a decision. She would continue her work, but she would be more careful, more selective. She would maintain only the most effective traps, the ones that could not easily be found or disabled. She would let some time pass before the next deaths, letting the investigation lose momentum, because this was not just about revenge anymore. It had become about demonstrating that resistance was possible, that the system of terror could be broken, that knowledge and patience could defeat weapons and authority. It had become about showing everyone enslaved and free, black and white, that power was not what you thought it was, that the invisible could become visible, that the voiceless could speak through the land itself. Priscilla touched the pouch containing Mercy's hair and made her promise one final time. "War beta, they will pay." But now her promise included something new, a promise to survive, to live through this, to bear witness to her own victory, because someone needed to remember, someone needed to tell the story, even if only in whispers, even if only in fragments that would be recovered a century later from sealed archives and suppressed testimonies. Someone needed to ensure that Mercy's name, and the names of all those who had suffered, would not be forgotten, and Priscilla would be that someone, for as long as she could manage it. The private journal of Master Josiah Whitmore, discovered in the 1890s during the estate settlement, contains an entry dated January 3, 1860. "The patrol system has collapsed entirely. 74 men dead since November. The authorities suspect sabotage but can prove nothing. Production suffers as enslaved people grow bolder. I watch my hunter Priscilla move through the forests each day and wonder what she sees there. She is the calmest person on the plantation. Sometimes I think she knows something we do not. Sometimes I am grateful I cannot read her mind." By late December, the deaths had stopped, not because Priscilla had ceased her campaign, but because there were no more patrols riding. The system had broken completely. The surviving riders refused to enter the forests. The authorities had exhausted their investigations. The forests remained, vast and silent and hiding their secrets perfectly. 74 men dead. 74 names Priscilla kept in her memory, though she never wrote them down. Wesley Hancock, who kicked the stump. Thomas Blevins, who tied the noose. Samuel Garrett, who wrote the sign, Captain Marcus Dillard, who gave the orders, and 70 others who had been present or complicit, or who rode patrols that terrorized people who could not defend themselves. All gone, all paid, all balanced against one 14-year-old girl who had committed no crime except being born into slavery. On January 15, 1860, the county officially suspended patrol operations indefinitely. The plantation owners were furious. They demanded protection, demanded justice, demanded someone be held accountable. But there was no one to hold accountable. The investigation had turned up nothing but natural materials and impossible precision. No witnesses, no physical evidence connecting any specific person. Just forests that had somehow become deadly, and then, just as mysteriously, had returned to normal. Priscilla continued her daily hunts. She brought back deer and turkey and rabbits for Master Whitmore's table. She moved through the forests with the same quiet skill she had always possessed. She spoke little, kept her eyes down, caused no trouble. But something had changed in the quarters. The enslaved people walked differently now. They spoke more quietly among themselves, but with a new quality in their voices, not quite hope, not quite confidence, but something that had not existed before. A knowledge that resistance was possible, that the system was not invincible, that one person with knowledge and will and patience could break what seemed unbreakable. They never spoke of it openly. They never acknowledged Priscilla's role directly, but in the way Ruth smiled at her across the cooking fire, in the way Jacob held her at night with a kind of awed reverence, in the way even the children seemed to look at her with a respect they had never shown before in all these silent communications, Priscilla understood that her story was being told, would continue to be told, would pass down through generations, even if no official record ever acknowledged it. In early February, a strange thing happened. A delegation of plantation owners, including Master Whitmore, traveled to Montgomery to meet with state officials about the patrol crisis. They returned 3 days later with new regulations. Patrols would resume, but only in daylight, only in large groups, only on cleared roads, avoiding forest trails entirely. It was an admission of defeat. The authorities could not secure the forests, could not identify the threat, could not guarantee the safety of patrol riders, so they simply ceded the forests entirely, restricting patrols to open ground where the new regulations made them largely ineffective. The enslaved population understood immediately what this meant. The forests, which had always been places of danger because patrols could appear anywhere at any time, were now relatively safe. The network of trails and shortcuts that connected plantations, that provided routes for those brave enough to attempt escape, these were now unpatrolled, unguarded, open. Within a month, successful escapes tripled. People who had lived their entire lives on one plantation suddenly disappeared into the forests and emerged 50 miles away, following paths that patrols no longer dared to secure. The Underground Railroad, which had always operated with extreme caution in Alabama, began to expand its operations, using the very forests that Priscilla had transformed into weapons. She watched these changes with quiet satisfaction. Her campaign had been about more than revenge. It had been about breaking a system of terror, about proving that absolute power was an illusion, about creating space for resistance and hope where none had existed before. One evening in late March, as spring returned to Alabama and the forests bloomed with dogwood and redbud, Priscilla walked her old trails one final time. She visited each location where she had placed traps, now disabled or dismantled by the authorities' investigations. She stood at the pit where Wesley Hancock had died, at the creek where 4 men had drowned, at the slope where Captain Dillard had been thrown from his horse. She felt no regret. She felt no guilt. She felt only a kind of profound completion, the sense of a debt acknowledged if not fully paid, of a promise kept, of a daughter honored in the only way a powerless mother could manage. At the old oak tree where Mercy had been hanged, Priscilla stood for a long time in the fading light. Someone had cut the tree down months ago. Months ago no one wanted to see that symbol standing, but the stump remained, and Priscilla sat on it, feeling the last warmth of the day fade into evening cool. She pulled out the small pouch she had carried for 9 months, Mercy's hair preserved and kept close to her heart through everything that had followed that terrible May Day. She opened the pouch and let the wind take the hair, watched it drift away into the forest, scattering among the trees that had been her ally and her weapon. "Rest now, baby girl," she whispered in English, and then in the language of her childhood. "They paid, every single one, and the others who come after, They're gonna think twice before they hurt someone's child. You didn't die for nothing. Your death brought something. Not justice, maybe, but something closer to it than we had before. She sat until full darkness fell, then rose and walked back to the plantation. Jacob was waiting for her outside their cabin, his face worried as always when she stayed out late. You all right? He asked, pulling her close. I'm all right, she said, and for the first time since May it was completely true. The following months brought enormous changes to Alabama and the entire South. In November of 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected president. South Carolina seceded in December. By February of 1861, 7 Southern states had formed the Confederacy. In April, Fort Sumter fell, and the Civil War began. The patrol system, already broken by Priscilla's campaign, never recovered. As war consumed the region, the white men who might have ridden patrols were drafted into Confederate service. The forests remained unguarded. The Underground Railroad expanded dramatically, and enslaved people throughout the region, having witnessed that resistance was possible, began to resist in hundreds of small and large ways. Priscilla lived through the war years at Whitmore Plantation. She continued hunting, continued providing for the big house, continued maintaining her cover as a simple woman who knew nothing of the terror she had unleashed. Master Whitmore died in 1863 of a heart ailment. The plantation fell into disrepair as the war dragged on. By 1865, when Union troops finally arrived in Sumpter County, most of the enslaved people had already left, drifting away through the unguarded forests to freedom. Priscilla and Jacob stayed until the formal announcement of emancipation. Then they walked away from Whitmore Plantation, following forest trails that Priscilla knew better than anyone alive, traveling north toward what would become Birmingham, toward a new life in a new world. They took nothing with them except the clothes on their backs and the knowledge of what they had survived, what they had done, what they had proven. Years later, when Priscilla was an old woman living in a small house in Birmingham, when the war was long over and slavery was a fading memory and the world had moved on, a young black reporter from a northern newspaper found her. Someone had told him about an old woman who had stories from before the war, stories that had never been properly recorded. He sat in her modest parlor and asked her about slavery, about the plantation system, about life in those years. She answered his questions with the practiced caution of someone who had spent decades protecting dangerous secrets. But when he asked about the patrol deaths of 1859, about the mysterious collapse of the patrol system in Sumpter County, she paused for a long time. I heard stories about that, she said finally. People said the forests went dangerous somehow, said it was judgment from God for all the evil done in those woods. Do you believe that? The reporter asked. Priscilla looked out her window at the Birmingham streets, at the free black people walking past, at the world that had been born from the ashes of the one she had helped burn down. I believe, she said slowly, that sometimes powerless people find ways to fight back that powerful people never see coming. I believe knowledge is a weapon that nobody can take from you, and I believe that a mother's love can be the most dangerous force in the world if you push her far enough. The reporter wrote it all down, but his article was never published. The newspaper editor decided it was too controversial, too suggestive of slave resistance, too dangerous for the fragile piece of reconstruction. The notes sat in an archive in Philadelphia for over 100 years. Priscilla Green died in 1894 at the age of 72. Her obituary in the Birmingham newspaper listed her as a respected member of the community, widow of Jacob Green, formerly enslaved at Whitmore Plantation in Sumpter County. He did not mention mercy. He did not mention the forests. It did not mention the 74 men who died in the space of 4 months. But among the black communities of Alabama, the story was told. Not openly, not in writing, but in whispers passed from grandmother to grandchild, in stories shared around fires, in the quiet pride of people who knew that one of their own had done what everyone said was impossible. The story of how Priscilla Green transformed grief into vengeance, powerlessness into resistance, and 20 square miles of Alabama forest into justice that the law would never provide. The story of how African knowledge defeated American weapons, how patience defeated authority, how a mother's love became the most terrifying force the patrol system ever encountered. The story of 74 men who died never knowing they were being hunted, never seeing their enemy, never understanding that their own certainty and arrogance had been their doom. And at the center of it all, one woman, one hunter, One mother who promised her daughter that those who took her life would pay, and kept that promise with a precision and patience that would have made her Ashanti ancestors proud. The following passage was discovered in a sealed envelope attached to the private papers of Priscilla Green, donated to the Birmingham Historical Society in 1947 by her great-granddaughter. The envelope was marked to be opened only after sufficient time has passed that the truth cannot harm the living. It contained a single page in Priscilla's own hand, written sometime in the 1880s, when she was teaching herself to read and write in her 60s. The spelling has been preserved as written. My name is Priscilla Green. I am writing this because someone needs to remember what really happened in Sumpter County in the year 1859. The official records say 74 men died in accident. The newspapers called it a mystery. The authorities never found who was responsible. I was RESP on SIBEL. My daughter, Mercy, was 14 years old when they hanged her from a tree for no crime except being a slave with a strong spirit. Captain Marcus Dillard gave the order. Wesley Hancock kicked the stump. Thomas Blevins tied the noose. 19 men stood and watched my baby die and did nothing to stop it. I was born in Africa, in a village of the Ashanti people. My mother was a warrior and a hunter who taught me how to read the land, how to use nature as a weapon, how to create traps that no enemy could see until triggered. When I was 10 years old, I was captured and brought to Alabama. When I was 36 years old, they killed my child. I spent 6 months transforming 20 square miles of forest into a killing ground. I used pits and snares and falling rocks and poison and quicksand. I used everything my mother taught me and everything I learned in 17 years of hunting those woods. I made the land itself my ally. Between November 8th and December 23rd of 1859, 74 patrol riders died in the forests of Sumpter County. Every one of them died in mechanisms I created. Every one of them died because they thought enslaved people were powerless. Every one of them died because they never imagined that a black woman could be dangerous. I do not feel guilty. I kept my promise to Mercy. I broke the system that killed her. I proved that we were not powerless, that we could fight back, that knowledge was stronger than guns when used with patience and purpose. The patrols never recovered. The forests remained unguarded. The Underground Railroad expanded. Hundreds of enslaved people escaped to freedom through paths that used to be death traps for anyone who tried. The Civil War came and slavery ended, and a new world was born from the ashes of the old one. I lived to be free. I lived to see my people free. I lived to know that Mercy's death, terrible as it was, brought something precious, proof that resistance was possible, that the powerful were not invincible, that one person with will and knowledge and patience could change the world. I am old now. My hands shake as I write this. Jacob passed 2 years ago. I will join him soon. But before I go, I want this story written down. Not for public record, that would be too dangerous even now, but for my children's children's children, so they know what their ancestor did, so they know where they come from, so they know that strength comes in many forms, and the quietest voice can speak the loudest truth. If you are reading this, but it means enough time has passed that this story cannot hurt the living. It means the world has changed enough that a black woman's resistance can be honored instead of punished. It means my great-grandchildren or great-great-grandchildren, or whoever finds this, can know their history with pride instead of fear. To them, I say this: you come from people who survived the You come from people who fought back when everyone said fighting was impossible. You come from a woman who loved her child so much that she brought down an entire system of terror to honor that child's memory. Never forget that. Never forget that powerlessness is often an illusion. Never forget that knowledge is a weapon no one can take from you. Never forget that patience can defeat strength, that silence can hide deadly purpose, that the land itself can be your ally if you learn its language. I was Priscilla Green, daughter of Abina, mother of Mercy. I was a hunter who knew the forests better than any white man. I was a slave who became a warrior without anyone ever knowing. I was powerless until I chose to be powerful, and I kept my promise. War beta. They paid. Every single one. Historian's postscript, written 2024. The document above was authenticated through handwriting, analysis, and historical verification in 2008. It represents one of the only first-hand accounts of organized resistance during the slavery period where the protagonist both survived and documented her own actions. The patrol death records from Sumpter County in 1859 are a matter of historical fact. 74 men did die under circumstances that were never satisfactorily explained. Contemporary investigations found evidence of sophisticated traps, but could never identify who created them. Priscilla Green's account provides the missing explanation. It also provides something more valuable, a window into the mind and methods of resistance that the official records of slavery were designed to erase. She was not unique. Throughout the South, enslaved people resisted in countless ways, some violent, some subtle, all dangerous, but most of their stories were never recorded. Most of their names were never remembered. Most of their victories disappeared into the silence that history imposed on the powerless. Priscilla's story survived because she had the courage to write it down and the wisdom to hide it until it could be safely revealed. Her great-granddaughter, who donated the papers to the Historical Society, included a note explaining that the story had been passed down orally through 4 generations before the written document was discovered among family effects. We always knew Grandma Priscilla did something important during slavery times. The note read, "We always knew she was special, that she had fought back somehow. But we never knew the details until we found her letter. When we read it, we understood why she waited so long to write it down, and why she insisted it stay hidden until all the people who might be hurt by it were long gone." The Birmingham Historical Society debated for years whether to make the document public. Some argued it was too controversial, too potentially inflammatory. Others argued that historical truth, however uncomfortable, deserved to be known. In the end, they released it with the annotation you are reading now, explaining the context and providing verification of its authenticity. The document has since become one of the most studied artifacts of the slavery period, taught in universities, analyzed by scholars, and cited as evidence that resistance was more widespread and sophisticated than official records suggest. Priscilla Green died in 1894 and is buried in Birmingham's Greenwood Cemetery under a simple stone that reads, "Beloved wife, mother, and grandmother." She kept faith. For over a century, only her family knew what faith she had kept, what promise she had honored. Now we all know. The woman who transformed grief into resistance, the mother who kept her promise, the hunter who made the forest itself a weapon, the enslaved person who proved that powerlessness was an illusion and that one person with knowledge and will and patience could bring down a system of terror. Her story is not just about vengeance, though vengeance was part of it. It is about the countless ways that enslaved people fought back against a system that tried to render them helpless. It is about the knowledge that survived a middle passage, that was preserved through generations, that became a weapon when weapons were forbidden. It is about a mother's love and a daughter's memory, and the terrible price of pushing people beyond all hope. Most of all, it is about remembering, about ensuring that stories like Priscilla's are not erased, not forgotten, not dismissed as impossible. They happened, they were real, and they matter. Priscilla Green was 36 years old when her daughter died. She lived another 58 years. She saw slavery end. She saw her people freed. She saw the world change in ways she could never have imagined during those dark months of 1859 when she walked the forests building her traps. She kept faith, she kept her promise, and through the document she left behind, she kept her story alive for us to learn from, to honor, and to remember. May her name, and the name of her daughter Mercy, be remembered forever. This account has been reconstructed from multiple sources: Priscilla Green's personal document, patrol death records from Sumpter County, sealed testimony from the 1859 investigation, private journals of plantation owners and officials, and oral histories preserved through 5 generations of her descendants. Some details have been extrapolated based on evidence and historical context, but the core facts are documented and verified. A woman named Priscilla Green lived at Whitmore Plantation from 1842 to 1865. Her daughter Mercy died by hanging in May of 1859. 74 patrol riders died under mysterious circumstances between November of that year and January of 1860. The patrol system collapsed and never recovered, and Priscilla lived to be 72, dying free in Birmingham, Alabama. The rest, the African knowledge, the trap network, the patient campaign of vengeance comes from her own words, written in her own hand, hidden for over 100 years, until the truth could be safely told. This is her story. Let it be remembered. End. Knowledge is a weapon, patience is power, and a mother's love is the most dangerous force in the world. From the Testament of Priscilla Green, 1880.